Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this policy seminar on the topic of empowerment in crisis, gender-responsive solutions for fragile food systems. This policy seminar is co-organized by IFPRI and by the CGIAR Science Program on Food Frontiers and Security. It's part of our Fragility to Stability seminar series, which is an initiative undertaken by the area of work on fragile and conflict-affected food systems in the Frontiers Science Program. This series is meant to respond to the urgent need for evidence-based, collaborative strategies to strengthen food, land, and water systems in fragile and conflict-affected settings. I'm delighted to introduce Anna Okello to deliver our opening remarks. She is the director of the Food Frontiers and Security Science Program in CGIAR, and Anna has over 20 years experience in research, research management, and international development. She's, through all of this, taken on advisory and management roles in NGOs, in UN agencies, in the Australian government, and also in academia. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. I'm Anna Okello, as introduced by Katrina, the Director of the CGIAR Food Frontiers and Security Science Program, and it's really a pleasure to open this important discussion on empowerment in crisis, gender-responsive solutions for fragile food systems. So we all know that crises, whether driven by conflict, displacement, or climate shocks, do not affect everybody equally. Women are often hardest hit, facing disrupted livelihoods, heightened insecurity, and shrinking access to decision-making spaces. Yet we also know that when women have a seat at the table and when their voices shape the choices that govern resources, relief, and recovery, communities rebuild faster, stronger, and more equitably. So it's this intersection between gender, voice, and fragility that what today's event is all about. So across the world, food systems in fragile and conflict-affected settings are under immense strain. By 2030, nearly 2/3 of the world's extreme poor are projected to live in such contexts. In these environments, we know that weak institutions and repeated shocks can silence participation just when these inclusive decision-making matters the most. And yet these same contexts hold extraordinary potential for transformation, especially if women's voices are not just heard, but heeded in shaping response and recovery. So as Katrina mentioned, fragile and conflict-affected food systems is one of the core areas of work under our Food Frontiers and Security Program. Through this area, we're working to generate rigorous evidence and actionable policy guidance to strengthen inclusion, governance, and resilience in places where crisis and opportunity coexist. Personally, having spent much of my career at the intersection of public health, livestock, and community development in fragile and conflict-affected settings, I have seen time and time again, like I'm sure many of you have, that systems really thrive when they listen to and reflect the experiences of those most affected within those systems, particularly the women. So for me personally, the work that's happening in the fragile and conflict-affected settings area of work under our program is not just about technical evidence generation. The end game of all of this is around justice, equity, and robust policy and programming. And today's discussion reflects exactly that spirit. We're going to begin with findings from Afrobarometer, whose latest data shed light on public perceptions of gender equality, voice, and institutional protection in fragile and climate stress settings, helping us to understand not only where the gaps remain, but where trust and agency are being rebuilt. We'll then hear from our IFPRI partners who are leading ongoing research in this space. In Nigeria, IFPRI and partners are undertaking randomised evaluations to test how advocacy and leadership training for women, paired with allyship sessions for men, can expand women's participation in community governance and decision-making, as well as improve their livelihood opportunities and abilities to contribute to peace building amid active farmer-herder conflict. In Nepal and Nigeria, research is exploring how anticipatory action programs for floods can better integrate women's voices using the Reach, Benefit, Empower and Transform framework, helping ensure that early warning and disaster response systems are both effective and inclusive. So these studies are generating early lessons and policy insights that we really hope to scale and deepen in the coming years through continued collaboration between CGIAR and our partners. We'll close with a panel featuring the World Bank, GIZ, Nigeria's Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs and ActionAid, who will reflect on what works to amplify women's voice in fragile settings, what evidence is still needed, and how governments and donors can embed gender-responsive approaches in crisis response. So as we begin, I invite you to keep one question in mind. How can we ensure that crisis response moves beyond simply protecting women to truly partnering with them so that their voices lead the way towards resilient and just food systems? So thank you once again so much for joining us and for all your commitment and work towards evidence-based solutions that put inclusion at the centre of resilience. Let's begin.
Thank you so much to Anna Okello for that lovely introduction. It's now my pleasure to call on Josephine Appiah Nyameki Sani. She is the Director of Communications at Afrobarometer. Josephine is a bilingual communications professional with over a decade of experience across Africa, and she specializes in stakeholder communications, strategic communications, but also stakeholder engagement and a lot of work on data visualization, which we know is very important in these spaces to allow us to understand the problems with which we're grappling. She's led initiatives enhancing visibility and translating research on governance, youth, and migration into policy impact. Josephine, over to you for your remarks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to go quickly into the findings. I work with Afrobarometer, as Katrina said, and we're Pan-African non-partisan survey network. Basically, what we do is to provide reliable data on Africans' experiences, evaluations on democracy, governance, and basically the quality of life. Why we do this is to ensure that Africans have a voice in policy and decision-making. And the voices of women in particular are very important to us. And so on the field, we ensure that our respondents are 50% women so that the voices are equally represented in our findings. Today, I'll be sharing with you findings from our most recent round of surveys that was conducted between 2024 and 2025 in 38 African countries. But you'd see that we'll be throwing some spotlight on some of the fragile states, especially those in the Sahel.
Josephine, if you're able to make that full screen, that would be lovely. Thank you so much. Often Control L will do that.
Okay.
Or just, yeah.
Right. I'm sure there's something wrong because... Is it
not
better?
to worry, you can continue if you're not able to go full screen. That's okay.
Is it better? Sorry.
It's not full screen, but do not worry, you can proceed.
Okay. All right, so on trends in education and attainment, we see that there's been significant improvement in the proportion of men and women who have both secondary and post-secondary education. But the gender gaps persist. So women are so far behind men. I mean, the proportion of women who have post-secondary or secondary education are so far behind the proportion of men. Over the past decade, if we compare these findings from 2011 to 2025. Also, when it comes to employment, women are far less likely than men to either have full-time or part-time employment. Now, what are some of the barriers that hinder women from entering and moving up in the workspace? The most cited barrier is the fact that employers prefer to hire men, followed by the fact that women lack the necessary education or skills, or the lack of childcare, or the lack of remote or flexible work arrangements for women. Now, about a quarter of Africans say that women are prevented by their spouses or other family members from taking paid employment, and they say that this happens either often or always. Now, if you look at the chart, you see that this phenomenon is most common in countries such as Cameroon, Uganda, Mali, Guinea-Bissau, Eswatini, and Zimbabwe. But it's far less common in countries like Mauritius, Seychelles, Sierra Leone, and Madagascar. When it comes to asset ownership, women again trail men when it comes to ownership of certain key assets like mobile phones, mobile money accounts, bank accounts, motor vehicles, cars or motorcycles, or computers. Now, the steepest gap is seen in the ownership of bank accounts. Actually, seen in the ownership of cars or motor vehicles, followed by the ownership of bank accounts. Also, when it comes to connectivity, women again trail behind men when it comes to the use of internet or even having smartphones, which means that having phones that have access to the internet.
Josephine, is it possible to advance slides? We're just seeing the trends in educational attainment slide. I wonder if you have multiple screens possibly. If not, Mabel could perhaps begin sharing your slide deck just to make sure you're able to share it all.
Yes, please, Mabel, please share the slides. I'm so sorry.
That would be great. And then you can just say next slide when you want to proceed to the next one. No problem. We have technical difficulties all the time. Thanks in advance for sharing, Mabel.
Thank you, Mabel. Okay. Yeah, so this was what I was talking about with educational attainment, with women trailing behind men. Next slide, please. And then when it comes to employment status, women are far less likely than men to either have full-time or part-time employment. Next slide. Now, these are the barriers to women entering and moving up in the workforce. The fact that employers prefer to hire men, or the fact that women lack the necessary educational skills, or the lack of childcare, or the lack of remote or flexible work arrangements for women. Next slide. And in here, we're talking about the proportion of citizens who say women are often or always prevented from taking up paid employment, either by their spouses or by any other family member. And this phenomenon is most common in Cameroon, Uganda, Mali, Guinea-Bissau, Eswatini, and Zimbabwe. Next slide. Here we're talking about asset ownership, and we see that consistently when it comes to ownership of certain key assets, women again trail behind men, and the steepest gap is recorded in the ownership of motor vehicles, cars, or motorcycles, followed by the ownership of bank accounts. And then there's also the ownership of mobile money accounts. Again, if you look at connectivity, there's also that digital gap where women are far less likely than men to use internet frequently or to even own smartphones. Next slide, please. Now, in the previous round 9, we asked women to tell us we asked all this, the respondents to tell us what they think the most important women's rights issue is. And majorities cited gender-based violence. So it was cited by, on average, across the 39 countries, it was cited by about 3 in 10 citizens. It's followed by the fact that there are too few women in influential positions in government, and also unequal access to education, followed by unequal opportunities for pay in the workplace, and then finally, unequal rights of property ownership and inheritance, which was cited by 1 in 10. Next slide. Now let's talk a bit about sexual harassment in public places. We have more than a quarter of citizens saying that women are often or always sexually harassed in public places, such as markets, on the streets, or in public transports. And again, it's highest in countries like Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Cameroon, and South Africa. And countries like Sierra Leone, Mauritius, and Tanzania record the lowest proportions. Next slide, please. Are people likely to believe women and children when they report cases of discrimination and harassment? We have about 2/3 saying that it's quite likely. It's either somewhat likely or very likely that people who report these cases will be believed. But in countries such as Chad, Gambia, and Namibia, we have fewer than half of the citizens saying it's likely that people will be believed when they report harassment and discrimination. Next slide. Are the police and the courts doing enough to protect women and girls? So we have about 8 in 10, close to 8 in 10 citizens on average saying that the police and courts need to do more to protect girls and citizens. Just about 2 in 10 are saying they are doing well enough. And again, in countries like Gabon, South Africa, Tunisia, Comoros, Cameroon, and Lesotho, we have large majorities requesting that the police and courts do more to protect children and girls. Next slide. When it comes to political participation, again, we see that women trail behind men in almost all the forms of participation that we've recorded, from voting to political party affiliation, to joining others to request action for government, to attending protests, to actually posting about politics or community affairs on social media, or contacting any of the leaders, to report issues that they are not happy about. Next slide. Now, should women be given an equal chance of being elected? The good news is that we have about 3/4 of Africans saying that women, make good leaders and should have the same chance as men to be elected to political office. But we still have about 1/4 of Africans who say that men make better leaders, and so they should rather be elected. And I mean, the support for women in leadership is a majority position in all the countries, except in Nigeria, where the citizens are almost evenly split. Next slide. So just quickly, next slide, I just want to show a few findings on climate literacy. Now, this shows the proportion of citizens who are aware of climate change and also know that it is caused by human activities. And I mean, so there's an average of 4 in 10 citizens who are literate about climate change, and it's highest in countries like Seychelles, Mauritius, Malawi, Madagascar, and Gabon. Lowest in countries like Nigeria, Mauritania, Tunisia, and Angola. Next slide. But if you compare this according to various social demographic groups, next slide, you'd see that women are less literate. I mean, when it comes to being aware of climate change and also knowing that it's caused by human activities. It's lower among women. It's also lower among the rural residents compared to the urban residents. And it's also, increases according to one's level of education and also one's level of wealth, basically. Thank you. And apologies once again about the technical glitches.
Thank you so much. What stark trends, Josephine, and also showing us that we're not looking at homogeneous contexts. There's a lot of important variation that can help us prioritize investments and understand where the greatest gaps are. So really appreciate you taking the time to share that. I'd like to pivot now into our presentations of some of the collaborative and partnered work that we've been doing in this space. So I'd like to introduce 3 speakers, and I invite them all to come on camera now. They are Vivian Effenbasi, Jordan Kyle, and Agnes Kisumbing. Vivian Efembasi works with ActionAid Nigeria as a project specialist in the Women's Rights Unit. She's a development professional with over 25 years of experience addressing a really wide range of social justice related issues. She is really a very competent in strategic program conceptualization and design and organizational strengthening for sustainability, as my colleague Jordan and I have seen working very closely with her. And so Vivian has been the lead on a project called the Metaketa Project that has developed and deployed women's political participation training curricula in Southwest Nigeria. So I'm going to invite Vivian to come in and present on that curriculum. Then I'd like to invite my colleague from IFPRI, Jordan Kyle, to come in and look at some of the early findings we're seeing from that work. And in the very early stages, where have we seen improvements as a result of these curricula that Vivian will be presenting. Jordan is a research fellow in the Poverty, Gender, and Inclusion, or PGI unit at IFPRI, and her work investigates how governance, institutions, and citizen voice shape development outcomes in rural and agri-food systems. Before joining IFPRI, Jordan worked at the Tony Blair Institute and the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. And then I'd like to invite Agnes Kisumbing to present. She's going to be presenting excited work on sort of making anticipatory action programming gender responsive, a very exciting type of programming that I know a lot of our donors and partners are increasingly trying to adopt. And how do we really think about gender in that space? Agnes is a senior research fellow also with the PGI unit at IFPRI. Her research focuses on gender equality, women's empowerment, and inter-household dynamics in agriculture, property rights, and development outcomes. She's co-developed influential tools such as the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index and derivatives of it. Before joining IFPRI, she has taught economics, and we really will welcome her perspective. So we will first call on Vivian Efembasi to present. Over to you, Vivian. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, yeah, I'm presenting and providing insights into the curriculum that was co-developed by ActionAid Nigeria, IFPRI, and research partners, and its impact in rural women in Southwest Nigeria. So the Metaketa project was a study, a participatory research agenda across 5 countries to improve women's empowerment beyond the household, including at governance level. Specifically, it was proposed to test whether a training intervention designed to strengthen women's sense of collective efficacy and leadership skills would improve their voice and agencies. And this was tested in 3 Southwest states in Nigeria, Osun, Ogun, and Oyo states. ActionAid Nigeria was a key partner. We partnered with NOI Polls, also in Nigeria, and researchers from IFPRI, UC Berkeley, and UC San Diego, which we referred to then as principal investigators, who were the initiators of the research. Phase 1 of the project was funded by IFPRI, while the second phase was funded by EGAP. Just a little bit about ActionAid. ActionAid is a global movement of people working together to further human rights for all and defeat poverty. We prioritize works with the poor and excluded, promoting values and commitment in civil society, institutions, and governments, with the aim of achieving structural change to eradicate injustice and poverty in the world. And one of our core strengths in ActionAid Nigeria is our years of experience working in local, underserved, and hard-to-reach communities, earning the niche of community rootedness. And for us, it's a core principle that guides the work that we do to end poverty and injustice. We work with communities to advocate for rights, promote positive change, and create spaces for people's voices to be heard. We have extensive experience in developing gender and women's rights programming, including tailored training. So on the Metaketa project, this research, our deliverables were to develop a training curriculum which included piloting, validation, and production, and training of trainers who would in turn deploy these trainings. These are just shared the actions that we took into consideration when developing the curriculum and its deployment. We had a community entry process that established connections with local authorities and helped to recruit eligible women and their husbands into the study. These curriculums were designed to be engaging, participatory, involving the use of carefully selected and tailored tools and processes that challenge and shift power. To make these trainings culturally, economically, and linguistically appropriate and increase uptake and quality, ActionAid recruited teachers, social workers, health workers, and other community-oriented professionals in each of the localities where these studies were carried out. These trainers were of the same gender, who were fluent in the local language, which is Yoruba, the most spoken local language in the southwestern part of Nigeria. The curriculums were also interpreted into Yoruba language for ease of use. This is what the curriculum looked like. We had one for women and we had one for men. For the women, they had 6 sessions. First was introductory. We looked at sense of group-based injustice, group identity, understanding men supporting women, perceived efficacy. That was broken into 2 parts. So they had 6 sessions. The men had 5 sessions. They looked at my gender, my community and gender, women and community development, men supporting women, strategies and opportunities for supporting women's active organizing in the community, sustainable support for women organizing in the community. So what were our key results? Immediate outputs. Training curriculums on women's political participation in English and Yoruba for both women and men were developed via a co-creation approach, reflecting input from community representatives in the project states. 75 community facilitators effectively capacitated to develop trainings in 450 hard-to-reach rural, semi-rural communities across the 3 project states. The collective efficacy of 300 women action committees was strengthened through a 6-month training using the Women's Political Participation Training curriculum. Now, these trainings activated the women's agencies, leading to strategic actions in which they engage with some of their duty bearers to demand for identified collective needs. And some of these results from their advocacies were provision of 20 solar-powered street lights with connection into households and some solar-powered radios in Labata community in Osun State by some of their duty bearers as a result of the women's advocacy. It's important to note that this particular community has never had electricity power supply prior to this. They saw improved varieties of vegetable seeds and loans provided for members of the committees by a local government chairman in Osun State as well. In another community, members of the Women Action Committees reported willingness and increased participation in childcare by their husbands due to their participation in the men's trainings. We saw a councillor candidate stepping down, conceding to a woman in one of the committees who was vying for a councillorship position during elections. From learnings about the power of collective, a committee in Imo community in Elisha started a large vegetable farm and chicken poultry at the beginning of the training and have been selling it off, recording profits. In another community, the men who participated in the training formed a men's club and set a target to ensure that the community produces lawyers and doctors within the next 10 years with preference to young girls. They plan to provide scholarship on this so that that becomes a reality. And what encouraged them was that, as at the time of this training, there was no record of indigenes that were doctors or lawyers. And so they were willing to give girls who were interested priority and scholarship. Now, what were the challenges? There were some challenges that were peculiar to Nigeria. while we're carrying out the trainings, we had removal of fuel subsidy, which increased cost of transportation, including the devaluation of the Naira. All this increased project implementation costs. Now, if you recall, I mentioned hard to reach communities. So difficult terrains, long distances, and environmental elements made access to communities difficult and affected training schedules. Insecurity concerns also arose while the project was being implemented, such as communal disputes that led to physical clashes, spates of political motivated violence. All this contributed to affecting timelines. Also, turnout in some communities fluctuated during trainings because participants had conflicting personal schedules. And then we also experienced demands for monetary incentives and compensations by community leaders. This also affected commitment by participants towards the training. What did we learn? For the terrains, a more in-depth assessment of the geographical terrains of communities that we selected would have prevented the difficult experiences we had in accessing them. Providing women with relevant knowledge and skills in the language and style of delivery that aids learning can translate into personal conviction. So when you meet women at their level with the language they know and the skills they can easily adapt, it translates to personal convictions, motivation related to social change actions. Approach to community entry, engagement with community leaders, gatekeepers, largely determines the creation of an enabling environment for projects to succeed. And finally, some men would be supportive of women's engagement in both partisan and engagement politics if they had better understanding. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Vivian, and for sharing what was an involved and exciting process of developing that curriculum. And it was such a pleasure working with you on that. And I know there's lots of extensions we're discussing now, and it's really exciting to think about where we go. Turning over now to Jordan Kyle to talk about how impactful this curriculum that you've designed has been. Over to you, Jordan.
Thanks so much, Vivian. And I'm going to pick up right where Vivian left off so that I can share, while Vivian shared some of the stories behind the results, I'm going to share some of the more systematic numbers behind the results of this study. And first, I want to highlight that in addition to the valuable partnerships that Vivian mentioned, this project has also benefited greatly from the support of the CGIAR science program on food frontiers and security, who we heard from at the top of the meeting, as well as the CGIAR accelerator for gender equality and inclusion. Next slide. So I want to start off with two stylized facts to motivate the project and to motivate specifically why we worked in Nigeria. So first, while we're closing the gender gap in some areas like health and education, although maybe not quickly enough, women's full and equal political participation in policy decisions that affect their lives and livelihoods lags far behind, and it especially lags in Nigeria. So while globally only 22% of members of parliament are women, in Nigeria these statistics are significantly worse, with only 3% of members of parliament being women. Next slide. The second fact I want to start with is that 17% of the global female population currently lives within 50 kilometers of a deadly armed conflict. And again, this is worse in Nigeria, with nearly 70 million women and girls in Nigeria living within 50 kilometers of a deadly conflict, among the highest number in the world. Next slide. We started the design of the curricula that Vivian talked about with three potential explanations for why women's voice and agency may be low, and this informed our study design. Each of these factors are worsened by fragility. The first is that women lack the time, information, and skills to participate, and insecurity and disrupted markets can further shrink these resources. The second is that gender norms restrict women's public roles, and that shifting the norms of their husbands in particular may be a necessary condition for their participation. The third is that women feel disempowered to affect change in their communities. and exposure to conflict can lower women's aspirations in these domains. I've linked here to a paper we've done in Nigeria before the intervention took place to understand some of these impacts on women's aspirations and participation. Next slide. So Vivian has explained the content and design process of the women's and men's training programs. I want to briefly cover how we set up the study in order to test its impact. We randomly assigned 450 communities, 150 to control, 150 to women's trainings only, and 150 to women's and men's trainings. Randomization ensures that any differences we observe at Endline are due to the training itself and not to other factors. In the control group, women's groups met once to form the group and for an information session on local governance. The women's trainings group added 5 participatory sessions over 5 months to build advocacy and organizing skills. And in the third arm, husbands attended parallel men's trainings using a similar participatory format. Endline surveys of women, husbands, and local leaders measure the impacts of the trainings. Next slide. In addition to the Endline survey, we also implemented a community grants program. This program was designed both as an opportunity to tangibly benefit these communities that we're working in. You can see here a group of women who secured a grant to form a sewing cooperative, and as a real-world measure of women's new advocacy and coordination skills. We implemented this in the full study area, so anyone from the community, including members of the community who were not trained in our program, were eligible to apply. And we want to know whether trained women are more likely to apply and whether their applications are higher quality. Next slide. So I'm going to show you today just a small slice of results from this project. But a notable overall takeaway from all of the results is the sheer number of different outcomes that this training affects, covering women's participation and voice in their communities, their livelihoods, and their sense of empowerment and efficacy. In these bar graphs that you'll see, blue bars are the communities where women only are trained, and purple bars are the communities where both men and women are trained. The size of the bar represents the difference between women in each treatment group and women in the placebo or control group. And the stars at the top of the bar are noting which effects are statistically significant. So first, trained women are 10 percentage points more likely to attend and 13 percentage points more likely to speak up in community meetings. If we look at statistics from Afrobarometer, who we heard from earlier, from the broader population in rural Nigeria, the gender gap between men and women in participation in community meetings is about 10 percentage points. So this is a large enough effect to actually close the gender gap in rural communities. Well, women in communities where men are also trained are no worse off than women when women only are trained. We are also not seeing any additional effects of the men's trainings for women's participation. And this is going to be a common theme across the results. Next slide. Trained women are 8 percentage points more likely to contact their local leader about an issue, and 13 percentage points more likely to say that the leader tried to respond to the issue that they raised, suggesting that trained women are not just more likely to raise issues, but that they are effectively advocating for their needs in a way that leaders are responding to. Next slide. Trained women are also 16 percentage points more likely to apply for the community grants program I described, and 5.3 percentage points more likely to lead the grant application process. Independent reviewers also rated their proposals as higher quality, more thorough and relevant to community needs. However, we also see that women whose husbands were also trained were actually significantly less likely to apply for a grant. This is something that we're exploring in further analysis. Next slide. We also ask women about their aspirations for their livelihoods and about a variety of entrepreneurial activities they could feasibly have undertaken by our Endline survey. We find that the amount that women aspire to have saved up increases by 38% relative to control. Women are also engaging in more economic activities in their real lives, designed to get new livelihood strategies off the ground. When we add up the 11 activities that we asked about into an index, we find a 7% increase in activities among trained women, which is roughly means that trained women are doing one additional economic activity by Endline. And specifically, we find that trained women are more likely to have opened a bank account by Endline in their own name, suggesting that this training is also driving financial inclusion. Next slide. We talked at the beginning about some of the psychological barriers that can hold women back, like a feeling that what they do doesn't matter or that they cannot affect change. We find substantial evidence that trained women have greater feelings of self and group efficacy, perhaps key mechanisms that are driving the strong results of the project. Next slide. Overall, we find little evidence that training men benefited women beyond the effects of training women alone. We do find that men's training benefited men by increasing their own participation. And this is not a bad thing. Many men in rural areas face their own barriers to meaningful participation, and our results show that this is not crowding out their wives' participation. However, we do find that trained men become more indifferent and less prescriptive about when and where their wives can participate, suggesting that the men's training may have reduced potential backlash. And this effect is more pronounced among older men. Next slide. Evidence from this intervention shows that locally led investments in collective agency can generate meaningful change in how women's voices can be represented in local governance. Over the next phase, we'd like to evaluate medium-term outcomes on women's participation, on men's gender norms, beliefs and behaviors, and on local governance outcomes like public goods provision and conflict resolution. We'd like to test the approach in new settings and investigate further partnerships for scaling. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that presentation, Jordan. And I will now pivot to Agnes Kisumbing, who will talk a bit more. I really like the direction we're going in terms of talking about what actually works to reduce barriers to women, to women's being reached and benefiting and being empowered. And so over to you, Agnes, to talk more about this in the realm of anticipatory action programming.
Great. Thank you so much, Katrina. And I'm really delighted to present this work on how anticipatory action programming can support women or be more gender sensitive, which was done by a very large team listed below and led by Katrina and Jordan, who you have heard today. So this work has recently been published in the Journal of Rural Studies. Next slide. So what's anticipatory action? We all know that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So anticipatory action programming is really aimed to design to mitigate and prevent disaster impacts before they happen. So based on a prediction of how a hazard will evolve, the stakeholders agree on what actions to take in advance with prearranged financing so that actions can be implemented. Next slide. So it's important to know that AA is proactive and not reactive. It involves distributing cash and/or supplies to vulnerable communities before a predicted flood or drought resistant seeds before a predicted drought. Next slide. The traditional response to a humanitarian crisis is to respond after the shock. So after the shock, that's when they do needs assessment, mobilize and allocate funding, target and distribute resources. But this is possibly way too late, or it's usually way too late. Next slide. With anticipatory action, a lot of the work is done before the shock. You prepare, you forecast, you do action plans, you arrange financing, you forecast the hazard, and you target and distribute resources beforehand. And as a result, the extent of damage is less under anticipatory action rather than using the traditional response. Next slide. So why do we need to pay attention to making sure that these interventions work for women? I think decades of gender research and the research shown earlier using the Afrobarometer results show that even before shocks occur, women are often disadvantaged because of fewer resources, livelihood opportunities, and less voice in local institutions. Shocks then end up making gender inequalities worse. So, for example, a recent study in Mali shows that only 5% of aid committees that coordinate disaster response include women, in spite of their unique ability to advocate for women's programming needs. Next slide. So many of you may be familiar with this framework, but I will talk about it again because this is a framework that we developed to assess the impact of agricultural development projects on women's empowerment. So a totally different setting from what we're looking at today. So we applied the Reach, Benefit, Empower, and Transform framework to anticipatory action programming to be able to assess the extent to which AA reaches women, meaning includes them in program activities, benefits them and increases their well-being, empowers them, strengthens their ability to make strategic life choices and to act on them, and finally, to transform gender relations and structures on a larger scale at the community and beyond. So this is the first time that this framework has been applied to AA, although it has been used widely for impact evaluations of agricultural development projects. Next slide. We worked with a team of very energetic graduate students from George Washington University with assistance of our local collaborators and partners to do fieldwork in Nepal and Nigeria to analyze gender dynamics in AA programming. These countries are both similar and different. Obviously, they have different cultural and gender norms, but they have significant flood risk. They're in early stages of developing AA frameworks, and even if their cultural and gender norms are different, women are disadvantaged because of low literacy, low access to technology, and limited mobility. Next slide. So this was primarily a qualitative study that gathered data through individual and group key informant interviews with government ministries, international NGOs, and civil society organizations, focus group discussions, and then we brought together in the analysis the Reach, Benefit, Empower, Transform framework with AA frameworks. Next slide, please. So one of the most striking results, and in a sense a bit sad, is that even before we think about reaching, benefiting, and empowering women or transforming gender norms, AA programming has to work. But to be able to work, it has to be implemented. And we found a lot of implementation challenges. There was a disconnect between the frequency of flooding, extensive damage caused by frequent flooding, and the lack of policy emphasis on disaster prevention. Forecasts are inaccurate, and early warning systems don't reach communities. Many flood-prone communities are remote and inaccessible, which limits the reach of AA programming. And even though we're talking about Nepal and Nigeria, the recent experience from my own country, the Philippines, illustrates how important implementation challenges are. Next slide. So when we do apply the RBT framework to AA programming, what do we learn? In terms of reach, we must expand beyond household-level databases that don't have individual sexes aggregated data. If messages are distributed by SMS, but women don't have mobile phone access and literacy, they can't be reached. Low financial inclusion and limited mobility make it difficult to access AA benefits. In terms of benefit, cash cannot always benefit women if they don't have the decision-making power to use it, for example, to purchase menstrual hygiene products, and when food and materials are not always available for purchase. In terms of empower, AA can't be empowering if women are excluded from community meetings where decisions are made, and if they lack information and skills about early warning systems. Finally, we found that gender norms are sticky, and that bureaucratic institutions are not necessarily receptive to the needs of women. Next slide, please. So finally, we learned 6 very important lessons from applying the RBT framework to improve AA outcomes for women. We need to improve the accuracy, timing, and reach of early warning systems. We need to extend household-level registries to the individual level before disasters strike. We need to consult women prior to flood seasons on the aid modalities and mixes and distribution locations and methods that suit their needs. We need to align AA benefits with women's preferences and needs, not discounting the value of in-kind transfers. We need to implement trainings for women alongside resource distributions, for example, flood preparedness and ability to monitor flood conditions. And finally, we need to engage with women in flood-prone communities over the long term. rather than treat disasters as a one-off event. Empowerment unfolds over time, and therefore this type of engagement should unfold over time. Last slide. And these are the resources that we used to come up with this presentation, and they're available. Just ask us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Agnes. Really exciting and nice to see the conceptual framework applied in this setting. I would now like to pivot to our panel discussion. And I wanted to invite our colleagues from the panel to come on camera now. And I will kick off our panel here. Fantastic. So this is great. We would like to have a panel now on promoting women's empowerment amid fragility. And so I would like to introduce three panelists. Our first panelist is Alethea Donald, coming from the World Bank. Alethea is a senior economist and thematic leader within the Africa Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank. Her research spans the study of poverty, social norms, labor, as well as methodological work on survey data collection. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development. Before joining the bank, she was a research fellow at Harvard University's Evidence for Policy Design. So welcome to Alethea. I'd next like to introduce Suzanne Gopak. Suzanne Gopak is a senior technical advisor with GIZ and currently working for the GIZ Peace Corps 2 project. Her work spans health systems, sustainable economic development, peace and conflict resolution, gender, food security, and livelihood. So all topics very core to our event today. Suzanne provides strategic guidance on gender, food security, and livelihoods, and advocates for gender equity and global fairness. So welcome to Suzanne. And then I would like, last but not least, to introduce Nkechi Olochikani. Nkechi is a feminist and social justice advocate. She has over 2 decades of programming and leadership experience, but her current role is Director of Business Development and Innovation at ActionAid Nigeria. Our team has worked very closely with Nkechi on this and potential other projects coming down the line. So it's great to have you all here. Thank you for joining. I'll kick off the panel here. I'd love to first pivot, and Nkechi, if we could start with you on this one. Maybe some scene setting here. I'm wondering, for you, working with ActionAid, years of experience thinking about these topics and in women's empowerment, what does women's empowerment in fragile and conflict-affected settings mean to ActionAid Nigeria? You can talk about what it looks like, what it means, what the goals are here. Over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, and good afternoon, everyone from Nigeria. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation and convening. Katrina, what does women empowerment mean for us in ActionAid? For us, it means addressing the 3 critical pillars within the empowerment framework. Of course, first, looking at the issues of equitable access to resources. Also looking at agency, women exercising meaningful agency and decision-making power, and thirdly, aspiring to and accomplishing achievements. All the speakers who had spoken before had referred to all of these critical areas and pillars of empowerment. But particularly, it means moving beyond just the primary outcomes that we have been, most times we've all focused our attention to a deeper level of results, which is about shifting power for women, and this can be evidenced in terms of participation in decision-making at household and community levels. It also looks at positive attitudes of men towards women, which can translate or find expression in reduction in violence that is targeted against women and girls. So again, like everyone has said, we see this from ActionAid perspective, knowing that these 3 key issues that I have listed are social concerns, and we know that disparities and inequalities has continued to exist. I mean, if you refer to the point that Jordan had made earlier, she talked about that women live within the 50 kilometers of where the conflict is happening. Again, but when you design intervention is able to get them to begin to, take control over their lives. So this is very, very critical because we know that in fragile and conflict setting, women are affected both by the fragility that they find themselves in and the already existing inequalities that has been there, right? So we know this. And we know again that by the way women, by their nature, they are prone to, they're very much disposed to being very critical in peace process and post-conflict reconstruction. And that's why, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which is the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, recognizes this. And for us, we now recognize this as an opportunity, present both as an opportunity and direction for facilitating women's leadership in conflict setting. So for ActionAid Nigeria, enhancing women's leadership in an accountable, humanitarian, and resilience system is priority for us. That is what we recognize as empowerment. It means taking critical actions, facilitating women's organizing and leadership in these difficult settings. It means working more with allies and ensuring that gender-specific and gender-transformative interventions to improve women's empowerment in fragile and conflict-affected states and situations is prioritized. And that is what ActionAid has been doing over the years. And I know that other critical actors are also doing the same in terms of advancing women's empowerment in the setting. Thank you.
That's great, Nkechi. You've set up the barriers super nicely for us there, and I think you've nicely highlighted the fact that we're facing a situation in which fragility and conflict are simply piled on to a slew of gender-based barriers, that you're grappling with these dual challenges that are particularly troublesome. I really like the focus on women's leadership as being priority here. This pivots nicely, I think, to Alethea, because Alethea, I know you've been thinking deeply about, what works, what's been proven effective for supporting women in fragile, conflict and violence affected settings. I'm wondering if you can talk about what approaches work, maybe think about what's working for girls, what's working for women, just from your vantage point. What are programmatic approaches that we should consider really seriously?
Thanks, Katrina, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So from the World Bank Group's perspective, ensuring gender considerations don't get lost during crises is critically important. Our gender and FCB approach focuses on tackling gender disparities in basic services, fostering women's leadership as agents of change, and addressing gender-based violence. But as you alluded to, how do we achieve this in practice? So at the World Bank's Africa Gender Innovation Lab, we generate evidence on what works to close these gender gaps. And we have over 120 impact evaluations, including in 12 FCB countries in Africa. So what does our evidence show? One is that many programs can be remarkably effective at improving women's welfare despite being implemented in FCB settings. And I'll mention 3 examples briefly. So first, a multifaceted economic inclusion program in Niger delivered to ultra-poor women substantially increased revenues and reduced food insecurity. The program delivered different combinations of cash transfers, life skills training, coaching, and psychosocial support, and found that including the psychosocial components maximized the cost effectiveness of the program, which paid for itself within 18 months. Second, we don't need to abandon programs that address socioeconomic barriers to women's jobs just because the setting is fragile. In Burkina Faso, for example, the government launched a public works program in the poorest communes of the country and added mobile childcare units to ensure that women could fully participate. The provision of childcare increased women's financial outcomes and mental health by about 0.2 standard deviations, with similarly large improvements in child development. Third, engaging men and couples is essential for reducing gender-based violence, but the specific approach matters. In both the Eastern DRC and in Rwanda, small group sessions with couples using fatherhood as an entry point substantially cut intimate partner violence, in the Rwanda example by 23 percentage points. However, a similar program in the same setting in Rwanda using larger groups and less experienced facilitators backfired. Lastly, other programs show their worth specifically at times when a crisis hits. In Sierra Leone, we were looking at the impact of empowering adolescent girls through girls' clubs, which included life skills and livelihood training when Ebola hit in 2014. Girls in communities with girls' clubs were 7.5 percentage points less likely to get pregnant and half as likely to drop out of school, leading to improved literacy and business skills. This is an older example, but the main message holds that providing safe spaces for girls during times of crisis can have a significant impact. So overall, our evidence shows that programs linking economic inclusion, care, norm change, and safety are among the most effective levers to strengthen resilience and equality in FCB settings.
That's an exciting amount of evidence, Alethea. I really appreciate hearing that and understanding, of course, that the targeting of programs matter as well, and the entry points, as you noted, in ways that you approach men, where we need to think very critically about design features of programs in order to ensure that from the start they're sort of geared towards improving outcomes for women. Appreciate those reflections. I'd like to pivot now to Suzanne Gopuk. Suzanne, we know that we've talked as a team here about the importance of integrating gender sensitive and gender transformative approaches in these fragile settings. I'm wondering what practical strategies GIZ has found most effective for ensuring women's empowerment during crisis response, during post-crisis recovery periods. What are the strategies that have worked? Do you have any reflections on how they can be scaled or adapted to be appropriate to different contexts? Appreciate your insights.
Okay, thank you very much. When Alethea was talking, I felt, wow, okay, it's like we were thinking in the same direction. A lot of organizations like GIZ in development and in the humanitarian space have quite a number of strategies that they use to support women in conflict-affected areas. It's the normal things that we do, but it's been proven to work. So things like asset transfers and cash transfers to women, especially in fragile contexts, really helps to boost their financial independence and also their resilience to be able to move on from the stressors that they are currently experiencing. Then another thing that has been in existence for quite a while is the VSLE methodology. Different organizations have different names for it, but basically savings and loans associations where women are brought together, trained on financial literacy, how to manage themselves, and then also pool their funds to be able to have access to finance. We're quite aware that a major barrier for women is an access to finance. So the VSLE methodology provides a very key support for women, either to boost their businesses or even for the social requirements, taking care of their children, paying school fees, buying food, clothing items, and the rest. Then something that is also very key is to have capacity building programs. Depending on the kinds of interventions, you tailor the capacity building, whether it is in agriculture, good agricultural practices, farmer business school, entrepreneurship, life skills, advocacy, financial literacy. Building the capacities of women is very key in trying to help them with recovery. And then our programs should need to be inclusive and community driven. We can't negate the effects of women's representation, the effects of their buying into the success of our interventions. So those are some of the things that I will mention. And then some strategies that I feel could be adapted and scaled are conducting, for instance, a gender analysis, a context-specific gender analysis, because I believe even within the Nigerian space, a gender analysis carried out in the far north, in the northeast, would be different from what the results would be different from what you get in the southwest. So whatever strategies you need to carry out, first of all, you need to have a gender analysis. And then it's key for the success of any intervention to engage local stakeholders, community leaders, religious leaders, traditional leaders, women's groups, youth groups. This will ensure that interventions are culturally appropriate, and also that the communities where we work feel involved. Yeah, we can't just come with our own tailor-made solutions and expect buying. The good thing is that in the past, interventions being done like that, we've realized that it really doesn't work. When the partners pull out, everything crumbles. So yeah, that's something else. And then, like I mentioned, finance is a very key thing. So, and I'm glad we have the World Bank here, tailoring financial services to be able to meet the needs of our women. Reduce the barriers that exist, collaterals. Most of these women don't have those accesses. Remove, in everything that we try to do here, we need to look at the 3 R's like Nkechi has mentioned, even though she didn't call them the 3 R's: resources, representation, and rights. Remove the barriers that affect women in the financial space. All of us have equal rights to resources. So support women, come up with more innovative financial programs that will boost women. In GIZ in particular, we're also having quite a bit with that, doing a lot of financial literacy for women, for persons with disabilities, just to ensure that our interventions are boosted and we don't end up losing. And then instead of inventing the wheel, we leverage on existing community structures, whether they're women's groups, whether they're farmer groups, or all of that. We don't feel the need. It is realized that there's really no need for you to go and start up something new. Identify what exists, work with it, promote it, boost their capacities, build their abilities to continue from where other partners might have left off. So those are some of the things that we try to do to ensure that we integrate gender sensitive and gender transformative activities in our programming.
That is really exciting, Suzanne. And I think you've given at least 6 great lessons for localizing development and understanding the role of context, the role of traditional leaders, the role of existing community structures, et cetera. That's a lot of super helpful infrastructure to think about when designing programming. I'd love to pivot now. Let's pivot back to Alethea, if possible. I'm wondering, you've mentioned, Alethea, a lot of research, a huge number of causal impact evaluations, which is really exciting, and kind of drilling down to those in fragile and conflict affected settings in particular, drawing out some lessons. I'm wondering where is it you think that we may still lack solid evidence? Sort of where are the research gaps, and what questions about how to support women, how to support girls in fragile and conflict affected settings remain unanswered and really need more effort?
Thanks, Katrina. So we know much more now, I think, about what works to promote women's economic inclusion and protection in FCD settings, but we do still have significant knowledge gaps. So the World Bank's development approach to advancing gender engagement and closing gender gaps in FCD calls for building the evidence base on how gender dynamics interact with fragility, conflict, and violence, and how large-scale operations can drive norm change and sustain impact. So first, I think we need a stronger understanding of the interplay between gender inequalities and FCD dynamics. Of course, we all know, and we started the session off with the reflection that crises affect men and women differently, but we still have limited causal evidence on how gender gaps evolve through displacement, food insecurity, or climate shocks, and especially which interventions help women and households overall recover fastest. We also need more evidence on the most effective ways to support the leadership and mental health of women and girls in fragile contexts, and how their combination with economic interventions can strengthen their impact. So second, there's a pressing need to expand data systems and real-time monitoring in FCD contexts. The World Bank Approach paper highlights the importance of gender disaggregated data and the use of innovative digital tools like this one we have at the World Bank called the Geo-Enabling Initiative for Monitoring and Supervision, or GEMS, which, for example, provides interactive mapping dashboards on services available for survivors of gender-based violence in Nigeria. More investment in adaptive data collection, such as using satellite imagery, mobile surveys, and qualitative monitoring to both broaden and deepen available data would help close the persistent data gap in high-risk environments. And finally, stronger operational learning is needed, specifically how to deliver safely and effectively in volatile settings through community-based systems, partnerships with women-led organizations, and adaptive management. So one of the more interesting findings to me from recent impact evaluation literature, this was in the education sector, is that intervention quality is the feature of context that most explains results, a lot more than just who or where a program is being targeted in and of themselves. But we lack systematic evidence on which program elements can be adapted in FCV settings without compromising effectiveness, especially for non-health related interventions. And we have limited evidence on effective strategies for building local implementation capacity while maintaining quality during active conflict or crisis. So overall, I'd say that scaling tested models must go hand in hand with generating new evidence on gender, FCV linkages, norm change, mental health, and climate resilience to make future crisis responses meet the needs of women and girls. Thanks.
Super exciting. I think these are areas of active interest amongst my colleagues, I know, and I agree on a lot of these pieces here, and the innovations in data collection certainly are promising and exciting for helping bridge some of the gaps going forward. Thank you for that, Alethea. Pivoting back, I wonder if I could briefly touch back, Suzanne, on talking about the types of programming we're looking at. We've been talking a bit about resilience and also the fact that climate change itself powerfully negatively impacts women. I'm wondering, how can we align women's empowerment initiatives with sort of the broader agenda on promoting resilience and on promoting climate goals? How do we bring these together? Maybe you could talk a little bit about lessons you've learned on programs that are trying to address these together. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Katrina. For us, we try to have an integrated program design. So on the one hand, we're looking in terms of women's economic empowerment, and then on the other hand, we're also looking at addressing issues of climate and building climate resilience. Yeah, so our program implementation is done in such a way that it is integrated. We bring the two together, and then you talk to them in terms of climate smart agricultural practices, how to handle so that they're able to, for instance, sorry, I keep on talking about agriculture. My project that I currently work on is an agri project, yeah? But we try to teach them strategies to cope, strategies that are more talking about sustainable practices for agriculture, talking about the use of renewable energy, using energy efficient cook stoves, for instance, supporting them to be able to afford it, not necessarily buying and distributing, but bringing that market linkage, teaching them how to make use of resources around them, sort of like a circular economy. Instead of thrashing things, reusing, recycling, composting, things like that, just to ensure that our approaches are integrated and they're sustainable, and try to reduce as much the impact that we have on our environment also. We also look, like I said, in terms of having inclusive financial services that will try and empower women build their resilience to climate change, because sometimes these things that we are trying to achieve are not necessarily available. They're not within the grasps of these women. But when we try to provide inclusive financial services, it helps. We're talking in terms of fragility. We also teach women financial literacy, how to safeguard their finances. Yeah. Now we have access to mobile money more than ever before. but the use of banking services instead of just keeping your money hidden in the homes, because we still work in a context where crisis still happens. People still run away. People still get attacked and have to leave their homes. So if your money is physical, yeah, you can actually get more worst hit even after our intervention. So those are some of the things that we try to do. And then, like I said, with the integrated program designing, there's quite a bit in terms of capacity building. So it's basically a mishmash of holistic interventions, looking at their financial independence, building their resilience, their life skills, and all of that. And then, like I also mentioned earlier, making sure that our interventions are community-based, using the structures that are available to them, not importing things that will be alien and will not be sustainable, so that when you build those community structures, those structures exist to support others, even beyond intervention circles, yeah? Ensuring that our interventions are tailored. Gone are the days where project design is done in an office in Ashbourne. We have things like appraisal missions, we have gender and safeguarding assessments to see, okay, what are the needs on ground? How do we meet them without having unintended consequences? We ensure that we do no harm and also leave no one behind at the same time. So we just practice this and then we adapt as we go ahead. We do continuous learning and all of that. And then some GIZ programs also go into the policy aspect, yeah, where there's the gender dialogues at the policy level, trying to ensure affirmative action for women. We've had quite a bit of success with some of those things. Currently in Adamawa State, with the advocacies that we're able to have, all the local government vice chairmen are female and they were elected. Yes, so some of these things are the things that we do. And then we also try to be collaborative. We don't work in silos. So even within GIZ, projects now reach out to other projects to see how we can harness and synergize. And then we also work with other international partners, local CSOs, government, community leaders, like I have mentioned. And we do a systematic review of the work that we do so that we see, okay, what does the evidence say? Yeah, we monitor, we evaluate, we learn, and then we continue. So
I appreciate these reflections, Suzanne. And yes, this holistic interventions, as you said, a great term to carry around in our heads. Appreciate that. I hope I can turn to Nkechi now and ask, looking from the ActionAid perspective, what are the gaps? You know, what needs to be prioritized based on your programming experience?
Yeah, so thanks again. For me, and from our ActionAid perspective, gaps still exist. And of course, we know that there are numerous interventions, just like what Susan and everyone has been speaking to. But we also know that within the Nigerian context, conflict keeps expanding, and it's also mutating and eroding the gains that have been made in gender equality and women's empowerment. So this means that we need to identify and interrogate the barriers and facilitators that could affect our effectiveness or the effectiveness of the interventions that we are providing. At the level that we are providing cash transfers or we are doing anticipatory action in humanitarian context, you still provide those resources and then conflict happens. So how do we deal with the issues of the root causes of the issues? That's where for ActionAid experience, we think is very important. And of course, from our experience from working on women's voice and leadership in accountable humanitarian setting, it's important that we narrow down or perhaps maybe target the restrictive gender norms and practices that undermines the effectiveness of the interventions we are implementing. Yeah, basically that's it for.
Thank you, Nkechi. Yeah, that's powerful and important things to keep in mind. I wanted to pivot to our Q&A, and we have some questions coming in online. So please feel free to add questions if you see that, if you have a question for any of our speakers. I'll invite all who have spoken today to come back online, and you may direct questions to any of those that are coming on here. But I'd wanted to start out with a quick question that I think that I'd love to hear Vivian's thoughts on this. It's a question coming in from Rejak Grover from the World Bank, asking about the feminization of responsibility, and essentially asking if women's economic activity and maybe their participation in their communities, is this adding time burden on women without removing other responsibilities? And so, what is the balance here between opportunity and overload? Vivian and Jordan, you may have reflections on that as well, or Agnes, but I think our research presenters can come in, and I'll start with Vivian if she'd like to come in, or she can pass to one of you.
I'll just reflect a bit on it. So yes, it actually does. Realistically, it does add a bit of an overload because women are already burdened with housework, unpaid care work. And now here they are having an opportunity for paid work. So they're combining both. Not every woman has, especially those in rural community, have the opportunity to have help and support from maybe a paid nanny or a cook or a gardener, so they do everything. And giving them an opportunity for economic opportunity where they make gains from other economic sources just increases the burden. But one thing is, it's kind of like a happy burden for women, right? Already they feel the unpaid care work, caring for their family, laundry comes naturally because I'm a woman, it's gender. They're socialized towards that. But the additional gains and the profits and the money that comes from being economically empowered, they tend not to see that as a bit of a burden. They see that as an opportunity and an opening for survival, and also gaining some level of respect from not just their husbands, immediate family, and the larger community. So supporting them to find a balance and taking care of self-care and their health concerns would be maybe where we come in. Over.
That's a lovely reflection. The opportunity for respect really hit me there is talking, and I wonder in some sense if this is a longer game in which women can recognize by having these positions of power and influence that maybe some of the drudgery might decline later. Any reflections from Jordan or Agnes on this piece, or maybe Alethea if you don't want to come in?
I just wanted to add one thing to that, which I think Katrina will also be familiar with as a co-investigator on the research project we've been talking about. But one of the findings that I didn't mention in my presentation was that in communities where we trained men, women report that men are helping more with childcare and other domestic tasks. I think this is an area where we would like to do some more detailed time use surveys to really investigate how are these things shifting in the household and how are men and women really spending their time. But that's one sort of potential impact of engaging men in when we talk about women's political participation and empowerment, is that men may be taking on more of these roles, especially in the childcare space, what we found.
Very
Yeah,
quickly,
please.
Katrina, sort of reinforcing this, when we use the project level Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index, which does collect time use data, we see this type of shifting of responsibilities is in Nepal, especially, which had a very gender norms changing focus in programming. So this is a different project, not this one. But men willingly, took on more household responsibilities because they recognized that their wives were doing lots of work for the community. And the men thought that it was their way to step up. So I think that this type of programming has a lot of programming for gender sensitization and for increasing male involvement has widespread use, not just in disaster relief. Thanks.
Super key points, and yes, that we should not always assume that there's any necessarily an increase in drudgery. It could actually be declining possibly in this. Alethea, any remarks you want to come in on this question?
I just wanted to say, to complement what has already been said, I think it's about giving women's opportunities and respecting their agency while monitoring when they might feel compelled to do certain actions because of internalized norms or other things. And I think 2 measurement pieces here are key. One is actually collecting even simple measures of well-being, right? If you see that, a woman is making choices and she reports feeling happier, I think we can feel more confident that we're going in the right direction. And the second is very simple questions on preferences. We have an initiative on measurement in partnership with IFPRI called the Measures for Advancing Gender Equality Initiative, where, for example, we have very simple questions that just collect information on between more free time and more income on a 1 to 10 scale, where would you place yourself? And we do see that most people place themselves in the more income bucket. So, but complementing these kinds of programs with simple questions to measure well-being and preferences, where I think we've done a lot of work to have better measures that are actually valid and robust, goes a long way here.
Thanks all for those really rich reflections. I couldn't agree more. I want to, in the interest of time, pivot to one last question. And I'd love to pitch this to Nkechi. This comes from Diana Lopez of CGIAR. What are the key considerations for scaling effective approaches and interventions? We know there are a lot of challenges in fragile contexts, so how feasible is it to ensure we can scale to higher levels? Do we still have you, Nkechi? If other speakers would like to come in on the scaling question too, feel free to do the hand raise feature as well, and welcome anyone to come in on scaling.
It does look like we lost Nkechi. She may be having technical difficulties. I don't know if Vivian would feel comfortable stepping in on her behalf.
Yeah, if you're able, Vivian, that would be lovely to hear from your perspective.
Okay.
How do we scale?
Could you kindly repeat?
Yeah, the person's question was, what are the key considerations for scaling effective approaches? We know these can be challenging contexts. So how do we scale, bring things to a higher level in more places and make sure it's appropriate still?
So understanding context, we don't come in with preconceived ideas. Understanding context, carrying women along. I liked what one of the speakers talked about, preferences. We tend to come with perceived ideas of what women want. And so, yeah, carrying women along, local contextualizing. So the world is pivoting and evolving towards local contextualized programming. So if we want to scale, it's very important that we scale based on local context, carry women along, carry the people along. People need to understand the methodologies we're bringing in, capitalize on what already exists. There are actually a lot of opportunities. So take, for instance, the Metaketa research, the study. We've been wrapping our heads around how do we scale? Are there potentials for scale? And what we have done is try to piggyback on programs that are not directly linked to the Metaketa project, but around well-being of women, and how we can integrate that into where the Metaketa research stopped, and how this can benefit the women going forward. So we can actually piggyback on existing programs that contribute towards the improvement and well-being of the lives of women and girls, while we think of where other fundings are coming from. Also, we need to look into community-based assets. Communities actually do come with assets. And so if we go into communities and look at what they have in existence, scale can begin from that as well. and not just looking externally.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry to cut you off there, Vivian. I really want to take up a discussion of scaling with you later because these are powerful ideas. But we are approaching time. So I realized I did not properly introduce myself, so apologies. I am Katrina Kosick, interim lead of the area of work on fragile and conflict-affected food systems in the CGIAR, and a senior research fellow with IFPRI. Just to wrap up, I'd like to say I really appreciated all of these rich reflections today. I think our discussion underscored that advancing gender equality in fragile and conflict-affected settings means going beyond just measuring outcomes and noting gender disparities, but it also means truly shifting power. Josephine Sani used the monumental data collection efforts of the Afrobarometer to help us all visualize where women are lagging behind men, but also really importantly, how this varies across different domains of empowerment, as well as across geographies, lest we think that all areas are facing the same challenges. As Nkechi reminded us, we need to help women take control over their lives, even amid conflict. But we also, in the process, need to engage men as allies who can help champion women's empowerment. We've heard inspiring evidence from across Africa, from Alethea, showing that even in very difficult contexts, programs can deliver real impact when they center on women as agents of change. In Niger, for instance, sort of adding psychosocial support, or in other contexts, providing mobile childcare to economic or economic inclusion programs that really target and focus on women. These can bolster outcomes for women, but they can also bolster food security for full families and outcomes for children as well. So really thinking also holistically about improvements, not only in food security, but going beyond and looking at mental health and well-being, freedom from gender-based violence. There's lots of promising programming, even in fragile contexts. Suzanne emphasized that interventions have to be inclusive, community-driven, and locally grounded. And so she talked about how you can combine items such as financial support with capacity building, and then have gender analysis that's really tailored to each setting. I liked her reminder to us that traditional, religious youth leaders can ensure that programs are culturally appropriate, locally owned, and therefore sustainable in their settings. Across all of these examples, I think one message really stands out to me, and that is that localization matters. We must invest in local women's leadership. We must strengthen community structures that can support women in those communities. And then we need to tailor financial and social services to reduce further the barriers women are facing. So hopefully we can propel women into positions of leadership and draw back some of the drudgery. Finally, as we look ahead, we need to keep building the evidence-based. We all talked about gaps. We need to look at how gender inequality and fragility intersect, how they do so differently across different contexts, and what works to empower women amid crisis, and really how to adapt high-quality programming so that it actually works in fragile and conflict-affected settings. If we do this team, this group today has convinced me, if we can ground our responses in evidence, research, and promote women's inclusion and leadership, we will not just help women survive crises, we will help them lead the transformation toward more peaceful, equitable, and resilient societies. Thank you very much.